We like to think of the Founding Fathers as visionaries, imperfect, maybe, but fundamentally committed to the ideals of liberty. The Constitution was supposed to be a radical break from the abuses of monarchy, creating a government that protected free speech, representative democracy, and the rights of the individual. And yet, within a decade of its ratification, the same people who built this system were already trying to break it. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 weren't a misstep or an unfortunate necessity. They were a deliberate attack on the core principles of the American experiment. And calling them controversial is a problem in itself because it suggests there's still a debate to be had. There isn't. These laws were a failure of the founding generation, proof that from the start, the very people who claimed to safeguard liberty were more than willing to undermine it when it suited them. The most damning part of these laws was the Sedition Act, which made it a crime to publicly criticize the government. That's not an exaggeration. Under this law, people were arrested and convicted for things like writing an opinion piece against President John Adams or making a joke about him at a bar. That means that in the first decade of the U.S. government, free speech wasn't being protected, it was being punished. And not in some abstract theoretical way, but through actual prosecutions. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a necessary evil. It was a conscious choice. The same founders who ratified the First Amendment, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, turned around and said, well, except when we don't like what you're saying. That's not controversy. That's hypocrisy. There's a dangerous assumption in American history that democracy was always meant to succeed, that the Constitution was perfectly designed, and that any deviations from its principles were just growing pains. But the Alien and Sedition Acts tell a different story, one where authoritarianism wasn't a later corruption of the system, but something that was there from the beginning. The Naturalization Act made it harder for immigrants, specifically those who tended to support the opposition party, to become citizens. The Alien Friends Act let the president deport anyone he deemed dangerous without evidence. The Alien Enemies Act gave the government broad powers to round up foreigners during wartime. And the Sedition Act, of course, made sure no one could publicly question any of it. This wasn't an emergency measure in response to a real threat. This was an attempt to rig the system against political opponents. And it worked, at least for a while. Some people argue that the Alien and Sedition Acts were a reaction to real concerns. The U.S. was in an undeclared naval conflict with France, known as the Quasi-War, and tensions were high. But here's the thing, no war was ever declared. There was no invasion, no internal rebellion. These laws weren't about national security. They were about shutting down political opposition. And that's why they were quickly repealed or allowed to expire. After Thomas Jefferson won the presidency in 1800, he let the laws die, released those imprisoned under the Sedition Act, and restored fines that had been unfairly imposed. Even in the moment, most people understood these laws were a mistake. That's not controversy. That's failure. So why does this still matter? Because the way we talk about history shapes the way we understand the present. When we call something controversial, we imply that there are two valid sides to the argument. But there aren't always two sides. Some things are just wrong. If we admit that even the founders were willing to sacrifice liberty when it was convenient, then we have to stop pretending that democracy is some self-correcting force that will always do the right thing. It takes constant effort to protect rights, because even the people who claim to be defending them will sometimes be the first to take them away. The Alien and Sedition Acts weren't a departure from America's principles. They were proof of how fragile those principles were from the start. And if that was true, then it's still true now.